So good day everyone. Today I'm gonna present my own topic which is the experimental research design. So first let's ask ourselves what is research design? So research design is the overall plan or strategy used to answer a research problem. So it guides how data will be collected, measured, and analyzed. But today I will focus on the experimental research design, which is used to determine the cause and effect relationships. So, what is experimental research design? Experimental research design is a type of research used to determine the cause and effect relationships between variables. So, in this design, the researcher deliberately manipulates one variable called the independent variable to observe its effect on another variable, known as the dependent variable. So, it typically involves an experimental group that receives the treatment and a control group that does not, allowing for comparison. Because it uses control and often random assignment, experimental research is considered one of the strongest methods for testing hypotheses and establishing causal relationships. So the main goal of experimental research is to answer these questions. Does one variable cause a change in another variable? So for example, does a new teaching method improve students' academic performance? Or does lack of sleep affect memory? Or does a specific diet reduce weight? So these are cause and effect questions, and experimental research is used to answer them. So these are the emphases of experimental research design. First, it tests cause and effect. So the main purpose of experimental research design is to determine the cause and effect relationships. So this means the researcher wants to know whether one variable directly causes a change in another variable. So for example, does a new teaching method improve student performance? Does exercise reduce stress levels? So in experimental research, the researcher does not just observe relationships, they actively test whether one variable is the reason for the change in another variable. So if the results show a significant differences between groups and other factors are controlled, the researcher can conclude that the independent variable caused the change in the dependent variable. That is why experimental research is considered the strongest design for establishing causality. So next, it involves manipulation. So it means that the researcher deliberately changes or control the independent variable. So in this, the researcher decides who receives the treatment, what treatment is given, and when and how it is applied. So just like for example, if a researcher wants to test whether background music improves concentration, they will assign one group to study with music and assign another group to study without music. So the researcher is actively controlling the condition, so this deliberate change is called manipulation. So without manipulation, the study would only show a relationship, not cause and effect. So the third one, it includes control and comparison groups. So another important feature of experimental research is the use of control and comparison groups. So the experimental group receives the treatment, the control group does not receive the treatment or receives the standard condition. So the purpose of having these two groups is to compare results. So just like for example, if a students using a new learning app score higher than a students using traditional methods, the difference in scores can be compared. So this comparison helps researchers determine whether the treatment truly caused the improvement. So that's the experimental research science emphasizes. So now let's us talk about the key components of the experimental research design. So first, we have the independent variable, second, dependent variable, third, control group, fourth, experimental group, and the fifth one is the random assignment. So these components help ensure the results are reliable and valid. So first, let's discuss what's the independent variable. So the independent variable is the variable that the researcher deliberately changes or manipulates. It is the cost in the cause and effect relationships. So for example, a new teaching method. So if a researcher is testing a new teaching strategy, the teaching strategy is the independent variable. Next, we have the dependent variable. So the dependent variable is the outcome that is measured in the study. So it is the effect that may change because of the independent variable. So, for example, we have students' test scores. So using this the same example, if we are measuring students' test scores after using a new teaching strategy, then the test scores are the dependent variable. Next, we have the experimental group. So the experimental group is the group that receives the treatment or intervention being tested. So this group is exposed to the independent variable. For example, we have students who use the new teaching method. Control group. The control group does not receive the treatment. It serves as a comparison group to determine whether the treatment had an effect. So for example, students who continue using the traditional teaching method. Random assignment. Random assignment means participants are placed into groups by chance. This helps reduce bias and ensures that the groups are similar before the experiment begins. Control, control of variables. So researchers try to keep other factors constant so they do not affect the results. So this ensures that any change in the dependent variable is caused only by the independent variable. So we have the types of experimental research design. First, we have true experimental design. True experimental design is considered the strongest type because it includes the random assignment, a control group, and manipulation of the independent variable. So an example of true experimental design would be randomly assigning students into two groups. One group uses a new learning app while the other group uses the traditional classroom instructions. So after a certain period, their performance is compared. So the next types of experimental research design is the quasi-experimental designs. So in quasi-experimental design, the researcher still manipulates the independent variable, but there is no random assignment, so the groups are already formed. So for example, a researcher may be compared two existing classes where one class uses a new teaching strategy and the other does not. So since the students were not randomly assigned, this is a quasi-experimental. The third one, we have a pre-experimental design. So pre-experimental design is the weakest type because it may not have a control group and often lacks random assignment. So an example is giving a pre-test to one group, applying a new teaching method, and then giving a post-test to same group. Since there is no control group, it is harder to conclude that the change was caused only by the treatment. So now let us discuss the advantages of experimental research designs. First, it clearly shows cause and effect relationships. Second, it allows strong control over variables. And the third one, it produces reliable and valid results when properly conducted. However, experimental research also has disadvantages. First, it can be time consuming and expensive. Second, some experiments may raise ethical concerns. So, for example, it may not be ethical to deprive someone of sleep just to test its effects. Third, sometimes it is difficult to control all external variables that may affect the results. So, despite these limitations, Experimental research design remains one of the most powerful research methods, especially in fields of education, psychology, medicine, and social sciences. So, conclusion: experimental research design is important because it allows researchers to determine cause and effect relationships through controlled testing. It is commonly used in education, psychology, medicine, and social sciences. So ends my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.